I'm Dr. Lily Hamoudzialou. I am a senior lecturer in International Relations and Security at Birmingham City University, and in this lecture I'm going to argue against human rights. Now this may come as a surprise because human rights are something we value and we enjoy, and it may sound outrageous for somebody to be arguing against human rights. What does that mean? Does that mean we're all extremely vulnerable and our rights can be taken away from them? Is that what I'm arguing? Well, I'm going to make three arguments against human rights. The first one is born out of the theory I've already mentioned, which is the theory of realism. And the theory of realism, just to remind you, says that the world is made up of states, and those are the international actors, and they have to fight constantly other states that want to either dominate them or eliminate them, as all states fight for survival, for power, and for their own security, as well as pursue their own interest. Now, if the world is made up of states rather than individuals, and the individuals are beneath the state, then what happens to rights? Well, realism says, it's the state that gives you your right. So whatever state you live in, that state, whether if it's the UK will legislate and will let you know what your rights are. If you live in Iran, it may be a completely different set of rights that you have, because that government at a particular time, and remember these change, may decide what your rights are and what your freedoms are within that society, perhaps based on religious considerations, perhaps based on interests that this particular state has that is situated in a particular part of the world. So the state gives you your rights, not a universal government and not God. So those rights will be born and implemented within a state, and they become meaningful within a particular political context, and they only exist ultimately when a state decides to implement them. It's really all up to the state. The state has the power, the government has the power, and they will tell you what your rights are. So that is the first argument. The second one really is about relativism and this idea of universality being actually a myth. There is no such thing as universality. Everything is relative. We have different cultures around the world with their own values. There are different moral values, different moral systems. If you take any two people, even from the same family, they may have completely different moral values. They may have completely different ideas of what the right thing to do is. What two people have exactly the same views on what the right thing to do is, what the moral thing to do is, or what is right for them? What two people have exactly the same identity? We all have different identities around the world. Imagine how those multiply the further away you go from yourself into other parts of the world. They have completely different values, traditions, live in very different societies. And so how can we speak of something being universal? There is no such thing as universal. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. That could be a good thing. We can celebrate our differences. We can celebrate our different identities, our different moralities, our different worldviews, our different ways that we think of ourselves in this world and what our purpose is, without needing to apologize or being ashamed of who we are. So this could be a good thing, that we're all so different and belong in different communities with different moralities and ideas and purposes. The third argument I want to put forward, and that is quite a powerful one actually, is that human rights, or at least the story about human rights, is another way for the West to practice domination on the rest of the world. So this argument says that human rights are only cultural, in the end, imperialism by the West. So the West came together, Western countries primarily came together, and they decided what the values are that they're going to impose on the rest of the world, especially the third world and areas like, for example, the Middle East. So they decided to come together and dominate through human rights. Now, domination is not just about a state sending its army to fight a war and occupy and take over another country and become the rulers of that country. There are many ways a state dominates, partly through exporting its language. Think how many people speak English around the world when it's not their first language. My first language is Greek, yet I speak English well enough to teach it and to be able to be a lecturer in English. That is part of domination. That is domination by a state that has English as its main language, and in this case is the United States. So exporting its language, a state or a culture exporting its food, its entertainment, its goods, its cafes, its McDonald's, its way of life, its films. So the more powerful a country is, the more it can export all these things around the world. And that is another form of imperialism. We call it cultural imperialism, also linguistic imperialism. And then the more people become like you, and they are not able to challenge your values, your actions, anything really that you do, because you have now dominated them. And they're kind of part of you, almost like a colony, but not quite. Colonization doesn't exist anymore, but imperialism does. So the critics of human rights said that the human rights are just a way for the West to impose its values on other parts of the world that don't have the same values and may have a completely different outlook of life and a completely different way of organizing their society. So this idea of equal and inalienable rights is actually creating a morality that others have to accept, even if it isn't their own morality. And who is to say what is moral and what isn't? We take it for granted because we live in a society where there is a sense of morality that is acceptable, but other parts of the world may believe something completely different that we may disagree with. And who is to say that we are the correct ones? Human rights says we are the correct ones, and everyone else is to do as we say, or we try them for crimes, or we invade their countries and remove those governments because we say they're tyrannical and they don't respect human rights. Who are we to say that the Taliban didn't respect human rights? It's because we have decided what everybody else needs to have as their rights. And that gives us license as big, powerful countries to go into countries like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Iran even, if that happened, in order to restore rights to people, to democratize, to enlighten. And critics of human rights say this is just another tool that Western states have in order to dominate, to kill people in other parts of the world on the basis that they're protecting citizens in those parts of the world. There is also this idea that the United Nations itself is heavily westernized. And the main actor within the United Nations is the United States. It's the most powerful country in the world at the moment, and it does dominate the United Nations. So this idea of nations being united is actually a myth. There is no United Nations. There are nations under the umbrella and leadership of the United States of America. And this is cultural imperialism. And it's a way that the hegemon, the world ruler, maintains its hegemony around the world by using human rights as a very powerful tool. And in the end, what we perceive as a bastion of equality actually shows us our inequalities, because we have the big powerful states treating others in a way that doesn't recognize them as equals. They're called inferior states, inferior cultures, inferior regimes that need to be removed, while the powerful actually triumph in the end. One way we see this is with Russia and Ukraine. Russia is far more powerful than Ukraine. And it thought, yes, I can invade Ukraine and take over. Of course, it wasn't done on exactly on human rights, but there is partly that, because part of that invasion is that there are parts of Ukraine that are actually full of Russians, and those need to be annexed, at the very least, into Russia. There's always some idea of rights that justify aggression, violence, domination, and intervention We call it humanitarian intervention, of course, when we do it, but is it really humanitarian? Or is it just serving the interests of the state, no matter what the cost for those civilians that will be on the other end of this violence, of this intervention? So this is very much part of the realist argument. Again, we always go back to realism when we do international relations. That says states will always go after their own interests, and there is no such thing as protecting human rights or going intervening in another state to protect the human rights of people there. This is a humanitarian mission. That is a myth. States will always go after their own rights. Western states, being particularly powerful, will go after their rights whenever they're able to do so, and they will do it under this guise of human rights and protection of others. But this is never true. And this is the argument against this lie of human rights.